Here's an imperative scenario, and the feature that I'm claiming to test is up top. It says movies should appear alphabetically, not necessarily in the order that they were added to the database. Pretty simple to understand. So if you kind of take the time to read this, and I hope you don't because it's super, super boring, but you will eventually figure out that it's going through that adding new movie workflow, once for a movie called Zorro, and once for a movie called Apocalypse Now, which should be sorted before it, but was actually added later in time. And then finally, when it gets back to the main page, it's checking that they appear in the correct order. The problem with this scenario, and by the way, this will work, right? If a human being did this, it's the same as the scenario doing it automatically. So there's nothing wrong with this from the standpoint of, is it actually testing the functionality? The problem is, from the point of view of being a good scenario, this is the only step in the whole thing that actually speaks to the behavior you want it to specify. Right? The whole point of behavior-driven design is that you're focusing the tests and your interaction with the customer and everything, not on the implementation, but on the behavior. All of this stuff in here is about implementation. It is very, very specific about the way that movies get added, even though the way movies get added is irrelevant to this test. This test only cares about, no matter which order they're added in, they appear in the correctly sorted order. So how could you do better than this? As you develop your apps, you'll find that the domain of your app can sort of form its own little mini language. So if your app is about movies and ratings, then things like movies and ratings become what appear in your Cucumber steps, as opposed to the step-by-step process of how you add a movie or how you specify a rating. Imagine a much more concise version of that scenario I just showed you that looks like this. Given I add Zorro with this rating and I add Apocalypse Now with that rating, then I should see one before the other on the home page. This is a scenario that really focuses on the thing I'm trying to test. So the question is, how do I get from one to the other? There are a number of strategies for doing it, but I will point out two key things. One of them is nothing here says about forms and filling out and the names of fields. It just assumes that somewhere there is a step definition that says, given I add Zorro with a certain rating. There's at least two ways I can think of to implement that given step. One way is you do some active record calls directly that create a movie named Zorro and cram it into the test database. You do the same for Apocalypse Now. You're good to go. A different way that you could do it is you could be a purist. And you could say, OK, I'm going to make it so that even these two steps of the test, even though they're not central to the test, I would like them to only exercise the app exactly how a user would. A real user cannot just put something in the database. They would have to fill out a form. So how can we make the test actually do that without having the verbal diarrhea of the previous slide? Here is a way to do it. You can basically use existing steps as a subroutine. So I could define a meta step, if you will, that says, given I add a movie with rating whatever, and the entire body of the step def is just do these steps. It'll take a little bit longer to run, but not longer enough that you would ever notice. And it will have the same effect as the very long scenario before, but now the main scenario has eliminated all of the cruft that really has very little to do with the test. And as a developer, when you go back and look at that scenario in a few weeks, it'll be much easier to remind yourself of what precisely you were trying to test. What about that other step about I should see something before something else? Well, here's where a little bit of regular expression hackery can come your way. If I have the entire page, I can say, well, I'm going to construct a regular expression that contains string 1 and string 2 separated by any number of any kind of character. If the page matches that regular expression, then it's safe to say that string 1 comes before string 2, assuming that each of those strings doesn't appear more than one time on the page. So there's a number of ways that you can sort of do trickery about before and after. But the important thing is you want the steps in the Cucumber scenario to read like they have something to do with the app, not like they have something to do with web forms. Those basic steps, like when I fill in this, when I click this button, when I click this link, those kind of come with Cucumber, but they're really training wheels. They're a starting point. And I will send out an email where you can see that file. And the comment at the very top of the file says, TLDR, you should delete this file, because your scenario should not be full of when I click this and I fill in that. They should have statements like when I add a movie that speak to the domain of the app, not the specific elements on the page.